Join me for a conversation with comic book writer Josh Barbeau as we discuss story hooks and how to engage your players and readers.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. All right, guys, I have an awesome interview coming up. But first, if you could like, rate, review, or subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening to it, I would greatly appreciate it. Those things help other people find the show, and I would really like more and more role players to know about this podcast. Also, if you could support the show financially, if you have the means and you really enjoy the content that I produce, supporting the show financially on Patreon would be a huge, huge deal. If you want to join my other fantastic patrons, you can head over to patreon.com/dicegeeks and learn how to support the show there. All right, guys, enough of all that stuff. Here's the interview. My guest today is a writer and game designer with Hollow Harbor Comics, Josh Barbeau. Josh, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Matt. Happy to be back.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a pleasure to have you back on. I think your first appearance was episode 24. And if I'm doing my math right and I don't shuffle anything around, this should be episode 108. So it is a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you. Yeah, congratulations on breaking that triple digit mark. That's awesome.
Yeah, I know. It's a little crazy. They say it takes a while to get a podcast going, but so I've been trying to get episodes out each week now for almost over 2 years. So that is really awesome. But the first time you were on the show, we kind of delved into your history as a role player and a game master, and we talked a lot about writing comics and things like that. So we're not going to cover some of that ground today because people can go back and listen to that episode, which I will put a link to the first interview in the show notes for this one at dicegeeks.com so they can check that one out. But I did want to dive into some things concerning story. I mean, that's my whole deal here, is that I think stories in all kinds of forms help make us a better game master. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about maybe like story hooks or opening stories. How do you hook that reader in? And by extension, how as game masters do we hook our players into campaigns? So kind of just to start off, when you're writing a new comic book, on that first page, how are you going to try to hook the reader into that story?
So with comic books, it's interesting because you have the visual element married with that text element. And, of course, there can be moments when you just have the comic book panels, the visuals there. You could even have, in theory, a blank visual with just text or something like that. Or you can have both. But I think that you need to have something at the beginning that is going to be strong. And when I say that, I mean, if you're going visually, you're thinking about color. You're thinking about, okay, what percentage of the page is this first panel going to be? Is it going to be a full page panel, just one large image on that first page to hook the reader? Is it going to be some form of contrast where you've got an image, but then what you're reading on that image, that first panel, whether it's dialogue or a caption box, it contrasts against the image. And so the first thought you have is, okay, well, those things don't match. How do I need to keep reading so I can figure out, how those things do match up or what the synergy is there. So it really just comes down to, what tone you're trying to set for your story, what you want to establish kind of as, the long-term style. And, and there are a lot of different ways to do that, of course. So I'll just use an example from my series, which is Tyrants. The first issue of that, you can't really see too much in the first panel of that first page. It's almost completely dark, and then there's a caption box that says "Here I am," and whenever you think about that, that's that contrast I was talking about. So he says "Here I am," but you actually can't see the main character at all in that first panel. And then as you go throughout the page, he kind of is explaining his situation and his life a little bit more, and eventually you do see him, and you kind of understand more of why he's leading with that. And so I think really that's what you have to go for. You have to go for something that's gonna create a question in the reader's mind that's gonna propel them forward, that they're going to want to have answered, because they can't just have that question and walk away without figuring something out about it. So I think that's really the goal there, is try to find a way, whether it's visually or whether it's through the text, to get the reader to ask a question about your story so that they want to keep going.
Yeah, and I think what you just said there is really important about raising a question in the reader's mind, and that is going to be answered. That some of them, I think, and maybe you can, kind of back me up on this or tear me apart, but like planting questions that some will be answered on the next page, but some may not be answered until, page 50 or 100 or the end of the story, right?
Oh, I think that's completely true. I'll use an example from TV. I think most people are familiar with the show Breaking Bad, hugely popular, fantastic television. But the opening scene of the pilot is a flash forward, and you don't know how far in the future you're seeing, because whenever the next scene that you get to, which is really kind of the official timeline start of the show, you don't know how the two things connect, and that's a question that you don't know from that opening scene if it's going to be answered in that episode, if it's not something that's going to be answered until the end of the series. And yeah, so that it's really a tease, right? You have to kind of start to put the pieces together, not really knowing when they're going to add up.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, there are some classic examples of that from, say, kind of going to television or movies, say film noir from, back in the 40s and 50s. Used to do that quite a bit. Say the classic film Sunset Boulevard. You start with the dead body in the swimming pool, and the narrator tells you he's dead, and
Yep.
Yeah, and you are going to get the story of how he was murdered, and you're just like, talk about a classic kind of twist and bringing up those questions, right? Here he is, here I am, I'm murdered, here's how I was murdered, right? It just plants that, we start almost at the end, but we get this question of how is he going to end up in the swimming pool murdered?
Oh, absolutely. And it's a beautiful visual, right? Talking about how visuals can hook the reader.
Oh yeah.
Because it's the contrast, it's black and white, but you can see the contrast of the blood and the water and the bright day. And then they echo that visual later, right? When it's technically in the past, but he shows up and stops and looks at that pool that you've already seen. And so yeah, it's a good reminder. It almost is like a second hook in the middle of the film or toward the early part of the film, when you do see it again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad you know it pretty well, because it's just an amazing movie. And you're absolutely right that we start seeing that swimming pool again, and that just reminds us that, oh, he's going to end up there. And it's just like almost a rehook, right? It's just a middle hook to just even heighten the tension of like, oh, will he be murdered now? Is he going to be murdered now, or when is he going to end up in that swimming pool?
It's that question, right? When is this going to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that is a very important aspect to the open, to get your readers to ask those questions. Now, to translate it a little bit to a tabletop RPG, how do we how do we hook our players in? Do we get them to ask questions like that?
Yeah, so I think that fundamentally, I'm glad you brought up, the players' characters, and I think that there have to almost be two questions, on the RPG front, or really any piece of creative work that involves characters who are going to be interacting with each other. But you have the dramatic question of the story, which in a D&D campaign, there are many different dramatic questions, depending on what that particular campaign is. But then you also have the dramatic question for the character. There's usually some conflict or some um, aspect of their past that is haunting them, or something that they're striving toward, that they haven't been able to get. And so it's really the relationship between the dramatic question of the campaign and the dramatic question of the character. And the player has to get excited about, okay, here's this character that I've created. How are they going to connect to the dramatic question of the story? How are they going to be part of it? How are they going to help drive it? How are things going to influence them that start to give them answers from the main campaign into their personal history? So I really think it's that question about, okay, what's the relationship between what I created and this overarching campaign?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and I always think that that is critical. Uh, and I know there's an overreaction. I think it's critical to have something in the character's backstory that I can then work with as the GM to heighten the drama. Now, it's become a bit of a cliche from game masters and dungeon masters who would abuse their power, and that the player characters creates their character, so there are no hooks. There are no hooks in their background. I've only had that happen a couple times, but I think that now, as certainly as I've matured as a game master and my players have matured a bit as well, that we understand that by placing some of those hooks in our character when we're creating our characters, that placing something like, oh, well, he hasn't seen his sister in 15 years and he doesn't know where she is. Um, that's just something for the game master to say, oh, well, your sister's going to show up somewhere, right? She could be a crime boss. She could be in trouble. She could just be a normal person in some town somewhere. But your sister's probably going to show up because that's going to increase drama and tension. And the player character, the person, the player, if they put that into their backstory, that just adds extra buy-in for them onto their character, into the campaign, because they were probably interested in that kind of dramatic kind of twist anyway. Isn't that right?
Oh, I think you're spot on, Matt. Um, One of the, I think, most productive things that a player can do when they're creating their characters is work with their game master to figure out something like, okay, what are my character's secrets? Because secrets can be a really great way to inject those twists, or surprise the character, or give them new wrinkles, or give the party wrinkles later on. Like you said, sister shows back up as the crime boss. um, I'm in a campaign right now. It's a Greek myth themed uh, Dungeons and Dragons campaign called Odyssey of the Dragon Lords, and our GM has done a great job of working with each of us to figure out, what's a secret that maybe only our character knows about our past, or knows about our history. What's a secret that maybe someone else out in the world knows about our character or our past that we as a character don't know, and that information would be very dramatic or very important. And maybe that's something that even the GM is keeping from us, at that point, or to be revealed later. And so I think secrets can be a very strong way to drive a fun campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you mentioned you're running, a Greek themed, or you're playing in a Greek themed D&D. How did your game master start off the first scene? Was there some kind of powerful first scene?
Yeah. So what was particularly interesting about the first scene was, you know, I think the location was a place that would be familiar to most um, D&D players, which was a tavern. But we were all there we were all summoned there. All of our characters were summoned there, and um, we didn't know necessarily what we were going to expect as players because there was a prophecy involved. But what our game master did to make that scene really interesting, because it was sort of an extended moment there, was that as we were learning more information, he actually flashed back to particular moments for each of our characters, and we would slowly find out a little bit more of about each of the other players, about how they received the information to actually go to that tavern. And so information was actually revealed as flashbacks, interspersed throughout that scene. So we almost had a series of mini hooks throughout that opening, that kind of made it compelling, because you were finding about the story and you were finding out about the other players. Again, just getting those little teases throughout. So that was a really neat way to do it, I thought.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, you're mentioning there the tavern, which is sometimes derided or has become a cliche, but it seems like your DM or your game master really took it in kind of a new direction. And I think that is something that we see, if we read a lot of stories, we see, or we play in a lot of campaigns, we're going to see some kind of similar opening sometimes. And what you were mentioning right there with your game master, what he did is he gave a purpose to why you were in the tavern. I think when the tavern becomes kind of a derided cliche is when you're all in the tavern and there's no reason for you just to be in the tavern other than you were stopping off along the road to get a drink. And so how then are 5 or 6, just random people who are stopping off getting a drink going to then coalesce into an adventuring group if you've given them no purpose or no situation in the tavern, right?
Exactly. And yeah, and that was, I think, what actually made the tavern scene fresh, was because it was taking this familiar setting and putting um, a spin on it that felt like it did have purpose. And so you have the opening scene and you've got these random players in there, but then by the end of it, it's like, oh, these aren't random, characters at all. That in fact, everyone was driven here, for a specific reason and a common reason.
Yeah. Yeah. And in fiction, of course, there are some kind of common openings that I think people miss. The idea is that you could possibly still do some of those things, say like the main character waking up in the morning, the main character trying to get to school or to work or something, or someplace. And the problem with not only have we seen them a lot, the problem usually is that there's really no reason or purpose in there other than just to dump a whole bunch of backstory, or to have the character like looking at, I don't know, a tombstone and just thinking about all of the events that has happened in the last 4 years. Well, all you're doing is a big exposition dump. You're not actually introducing us to some kind of conflict or raising some of those questions. Do you think that's true?
I absolutely think it's true. The in medias res is the phrase, right in the middle of
Yeah.
things, where you want to try and start either in the action as it's already going, or as close to you can to the central conflict, because that's what's going to keep a reader's interest, or in the case of an RPG, a player's interest. You want to start things really where the character is going to be forced to make hard decisions. So there's nothing particularly compelling about I'm generalizing here because I'm sure, as with everything, there's a way to make it fresh and new and
Sure.
interesting again. But
Sure.
just to use the generalization, but turning off the alarm clock, brushing your teeth, getting in your car, driving to work, if nothing's happening there, and like you said, we're just sort of getting general information about the character, it's not going to be particularly compelling. Now, if you were to do something like you're starting in the car, and this is just a basic example, I'm sure there's stronger ones, but you're starting in the car, and 10 seconds into the opening shot, there's a car crash with the main character in it, and then you cut back 30 minutes earlier, 40 an hour earlier, whatever, and they wake up and they're brushing their teeth, and there's still something interesting in those scenes, but you kind of know kind of where it's leading, or what the conflict is going to be. Maybe you're finding out that They had to borrow their brother's vehicle, which they didn't want to do it that morning. And so you already have a sense of what's dramatic about those early moments, so that, you really want to find those things that are going to make the person who's watching it, reading it, feel invested.
Yeah. And it is interesting, I mean, especially with that kind of waking up in the morning scenes and that, and, and we mentioned kind of the tavern scene. I think the idea is that we've seen it done well in a number of examples. I think the waking up kind of, at least in movies, you could take Back to the Future, right? That Marty wakes up and we get, some of this, we get a lot of his backstory, but it's in the movie, it's very visual, right? We get the idea that he knows a crazy inventor, that he's kind of, he's a musician, that he, or wants to be a musician, that he's kind of a sloppy teenager kind of thing. And we kind of get all of that really quickly in very, interesting ways, because Michael J. Fox was awesome. The writing was awesome. The situations are awesome. And I think that sometimes, perhaps even, not even realizing it, we're trying to recreate that, but, we're not giving those scenes a point or a purpose that is going to lead to something down the road, like what is going to happen with Marty in Back to the Future.
Totally. And that opening is doing a lot of character work, and you just described some of what it's doing. And it starts off with him. It's been a little while since I've seen Back to the Future, but I believe he wakes up incredibly late, right? Like, and he's
Yes.
rushing. And
Yes.
so, you already know he's already pressed for time. And so that in and of itself is a hook, because he's rushing. I think another good example of how to keep something fresh that might be familiar with, is The Devil Wears Prada, where you've got these characters that are, these women who are getting ready in the morning, and you're cutting between different ones, and some of them are putting on, fancy shoes and dresses and makeup, and then you're contrasting that with, the main character, who is less interested in those things, and her morning routine looks a lot different. And so that's that contrast that I was talking about. You're finding out a lot about the main character, not by showing us necessarily who she is, but by showing us who she isn't, relative to the other people that you're comparing her against in that opening, which are characters that you never see again through the rest of the movie. So there are fresh ways to do it, of course, but you have to be very intentional, and you have to understand how you're making it fresh, how you're doing that character and story work, if you're gonna go in that direction.
Yeah, and I think it is very critical. And of course, you are absolutely right there about the Back to the Future one, that opening scene tells us time, right? And what's the whole movie going to be about? It's going to be
Exactly.
about time,
It's
right?
thematic. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're showing us something like that, if your hero or whatever is waking up in the morning, why are you showing that? Or your example of the Devil Wears Prada, right? Our heroine. Why are we seeing those things? Not just because, sadly, right, we've seen or read maybe 30 books where somebody wakes up in the morning, right? Hopefully we're giving the reader or the audience the reason why we're showing those things. So yeah, Marty is late. Time, he needs more time, he's wasting his time in some places, and the whole movie is going to be about time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And now, of course, which something that I really appreciate is that you have picked up my novel that I have recently written, The Spaceport Gambit. It's my first try, and you are reading it right now. And I just wanted, it's just a kind of an interesting exercise for me as an author, just to ask you, since we're talking about openings, what did you think about how I opened the novel of Spaceport Gambit?
Yes, so I'm so excited because, like you said, I'm in the middle of the book right now. I'm almost halfway through. What I felt was particularly interesting about the way that you open the book was you actually start with a quote, right? So you've got the quote from a poet in there, and I think that I think about, for instance, when it comes to some great sci-fi, right? Like Dune, you've got those
Mhm.
quotes at the beginning of each chapter that, that do a lot of work thematically and kind of hint at things to come, or just kind of set the tone. And I love that you kind of start with that with each new part of the book. Of you've got that poet who's kind of giving us a flavor for what's to expect. But again, we talk about starting in the middle of things. That's really where the book opens. You've got this firefight in space, and you're in the middle, you're in the thick of a battle just to begin it, and so there's already conflict that's happening. You're wondering how this matches up with what is what we know about science fiction already, what we've seen with different space elements. But you've got this compelling character who's kind of taking control of the situation, and you've got these pirates, and there's just a lot of those questions. I think that even in the first chapter, you kind of want to see where those threads go.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, thank you there. The leading off with quotes, of course, is a convention that I think is that I absolutely love. And I talked more about this in my interview when I interviewed Robert Hewitt Wolf, who was the creator of the TV show Andromeda. If anybody, I don't know if you remember that show, or if anybody listening does, I remember that show quite a bit because each episode began with a quote from somewhere, from some famous person in the past that we don't know. Like the audience didn't know who that person was, or how it was connected. Even the year system, we didn't even really understand that. But it gave a quote that fit the theme of the episode. But it just what those quotes do, and I've used this in my Kings Road campaign setting for 5e as well. Those quotes just are a very simple way to give your world just an immense feeling of history and time and extra weight without without writing 2 volumes of like dry history. You can just give a quote from some that's quoted from some book or for some person, and you just add weight right there to your story.
100%. And I think with that particular quote, we were talking about theme at the opening of Back to the Future, and that's really, I think, what your quote does for your book at the beginning of Spaceport Gambit is, you're talking about a bet and risk, and that's really what is driving Gwen as she's making these decisions with this derelict spaceport. And it's all about that. I don't think it's a spoiler because it's right there at the beginning and some of the opening chapters, but she has to make a decision whether she's going to give up her corporate career for this empty spaceport that it has not been in use for years, and it's potentially dangerous and a really risky move for her to find a way to purchase and restart that spaceport. And that's the dramatic question really, is what is she willing to sacrifice in her life, this opportunity or what she's already built. So yeah, I think it is, especially we're talking about dramatic character questions. That's what I felt hers was, at least in the opening there. And it's been kind of exciting to see that thread so far.
Well, thank you for for some of that. As I was mentioning earlier before we started recording, it's always hard to judge your own writing, and I'm glad to hear that feedback, that I was able to kind of hook people and kind of carry you along with some of those questions. And so
Yeah, I'm enjoying it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, and I really appreciate that, because that was something that was on my mind.
Well, and I'll mention another thing that I,
Mhm.
in the book here that I think you do really well, Matt, is the chapters are short, and I think that really generates a sense of momentum because every chapter is ending on its own. We talked about mini hooks, right? Things that are going to continue to, or cliffhangers, right? Might be another way to phrase it. Each chapter is ending on this cliffhanger, and so you've got these short chapters, but it's almost a series of cliffhangers, and you can't wait to get back to what that character is up to, and this character's task that they're trying to complete but having difficulties with, and how they all intersect with each other. And so I really like the way that you use those quick chapters to number one, bring all the characters together, and then blow them back apart, and but also to just build that momentum and keep that level of investment in the story as it builds.
That was definitely intentional. That I wanted to do that, and because I mean, this goes to a broader point that's a little bit maybe out there for some listeners, but it is very noticeable to see how literature and novels are changing in the present day, as opposed to even a novel that was written in 2005, let alone 85, let alone 1885, just to see how they are changing in a world when I'm throwing a novel into the world and I am competing not only with the latest Marvel movie, but I'm competing with a 4-minute YouTube video that's hilarious, and 4,000 other novels that were published the same, every day on Amazon. So, I was really trying to be conscious of, how do I keep somebody reading this while crafting a fun and entertaining story that people just have to turn the next page to find out what happens.
Exactly. Yeah, I think those bite-sized segments are a great way to do it, and I think that it's a good lesson, creatively, whether as a dungeon master or as a writer, of really the lesson being, once you have that first hook, or you feel like you've conveyed the the concept of the story, don't just coast through the rest of the story, and don't just kind of put your characters on rails and tell it. Make sure that you are putting in those cliffhangers, adding dramatic questions, and start to answer them too, as you're approaching the end of the story. But what are those things that you can continue to put in that are going to make the reader or the players in your campaign say, okay, well, what's coming next? What's this character going to do? How are they going to get out of this? How is this going to get resolved? You have to keep that in your mind throughout, not just at the beginning, but as many chances you can get without it feeling overdone or melodramatic, of course. But you just make sure that you're thinking about that pacing, and how you're continuing to create a current of momentum throughout.
I think that is critical, especially when you're talking about an RPG campaign, that when a campaign, especially one that starts to go on kind of for a long time, and you're really kind of grinding out some of those levels, and you started at level 1 or level 3, and now you're level 12 or something, that there should always be something there that your players are like, yeah, I know we've been playing for like a year, but man, I can't wait until this next session, because that's going to be so cool.
Absolutely. The characters are, they should continue to change. And as I mentioned before, having those secrets that the dungeon master can kind of drop in at intervals, again, to create that momentum, to push the story forward. That's why some of those things are so interesting, and why I think a lot of the resource books are helpful, because they can, create ideas in the DM's mind that, or that they can jot down for future reference if they ever need to pull a moment out, or keep things interesting, to do that.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point right there. I do want to follow up on in medias res, but before that, you just mentioned like these little secrets, or these little things that the GM or the DM can pull out later on. And I thought it was just a great example from a number of years ago. A friend of mine was GMing us in a Star Trek campaign. And I'll admit it, I basically just forced my group to play Star Trek because I wanted to play Star Trek so bad. And so he's GMing us. He was doing a great job. And we had something happen kind of in our first session. And this situation happened in this first session. We discovered this planet and there was a situation. Well, then we went on a few, basically they were almost self-contained sessions, almost just like kind of Star Trek episodes. Like
Sounds very Trekkian. Yep.
Yeah, very Trekky. So it was very episodic, but I was really enjoying it. I love Star Trek, so I was really enjoying it. We kind of went on these episodic, missions for a while. I can't remember exactly, but I would say there was at least 8 or 9 sessions, and then we gather again for a session, and the game master, he's like, oh, your ship's counselor, he went on this, to this conference or whatever. I'm just like, okay, whatever, and I think that actually had carried over a couple episodes, a couple of the kind of the episodes, and it was like, he doesn't come back. And I was like, oh no. So what, now we're going to do like a missing persons one. This is going to be fun. And so we start an investigation and we start looking into it. And they were like, well, actually, he had wrapped up a lot of his affairs on the ship. Well, actually this, and he also downloaded some data from the main computer. And we looked at that, and it was information concerning the first session, something that had happened in the first session and I had totally forgotten about it. It was like the game master just dropped a bomb on me, and it was something that could potentially be very dangerous, but I hadn't even considered the consequences of that. And the GM just dropped it on us, and that took us into then kind of this arc where we had to find our ship's counselor who had deserted Starfleet and had some of this potentially dangerous kind of information or material. And it led us into a really powerful arc that kind of came to a really good climax over, several sessions. So it just blew my mind. And I thought he did a fantastic job of taking something from the first session and then kind of dropping it when we had all forgotten about it, kind of in the middle, and then giving us a good, almost like kind of run to a climax to kind of finish out our season, if we were talking about like a television season. And I thought it was just fantastic.
It's really narratively satisfying because it makes the whole campaign feel intentional, especially when you have things from, the first session or first few sessions that come back in a really big way. Like you said, things that, maybe feel inconsequential or like flavor details that turn out to be really important. And I mean, those are what all of us should strive for, when we're in our campaigns. And I think especially as a player, sometimes you can maybe get a little bit complacent and maybe start to rely on the person who's leading the campaign a little too much to direct your character. But remember, that's still your character. You're still in charge of their arc, their growth, how they change, what decisions they make ultimately, and all, try and keep that in your mind too of, what are some interesting things that I can do with my character that are going to, drive them, toward what we're doing, but then they're going to have to interact with what the DM's throwing at me at the same time. And if you're doing that, then that's really what's going to make those plot bombs really, really exciting, because your character had one set of information, you're making decisions based on those things to the best of your ability, and now you've got to react. Whereas if you were kind of just coasting, your character might not feel as connected to something as big as, what you just described to us there, Matt. And so, I think that's really where the player interaction and, the GM or DM planning can come into, they can connect in a way that's really, really satisfying.
Yeah. And I think too, it's just always kind of as a game master little trick, I guess. I don't know if it's a trick, but it's a tip. But just wait until the player has forgot about something in their backstory. So the player, they're going through dungeons, they're doing some really cool stuff, and they've forgotten that they said that they haven't seen their sister in 10 years, or that she disappeared when they were teenagers or something. And then at this moment when they're thinking about some other thing, you drop the sister on them, right? You drop that, whatever that is, in their backstory on them, and they are just like, wait, what? Oh my gosh. And it feels like, even if you didn't plan it out very well, it feels like it was planned and put there on purpose, kind of right at this moment when the player wasn't, thinking they would have to deal with something like that.
Yes, and because it was in the player's backstory, even though they didn't make that decision, it feels like they're influencing the world, right? Because a detail that they created is now having an impact.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then you had mentioned in medias res, kind of starting in the middle of things. I think that's what it exactly means, is in the middle of things. And you had mentioned that a little bit. And I wanted to run a little, a little scenario by you. I might have mentioned it in another episode or something like that. But of course, I've written a little book called No Prep Game Master. And, because I talk to, I'm trying to talk to people. I know there's people who plan and do a lot of preparation, and that's awesome. But, I'm trying to talk to people who, have jobs, have families, have tons of responsibilities. They have 3 hours, to play D&D with their friends one night a week. They don't have an extra 3 hours, during the week to prep. And so I talk a lot about that. So I find in medias res can be very helpful if you're starting off a campaign where you just have not, where you're just not able to prepare. And I've used this a number of times with my players, and I usually get a really positive response. So I kind of wanted to run it past you, but it's just that first, kind of scene, like we've either texted or talked about it, or we have, kind of a partial, session zero where we get all the characters together and we know how they're together. And then usually what I would do is I would just throw them into a situation like with combat kind of right off the bat. So they have to start making, quick decisions, and then the combat opens up questions. And so one example, we were running a Star Wars campaign some years back. I had no time to prep. I was working I was working a lot of hours. I had no time to prep, but we were texting, we were messaging, and we got all the characters worked out. We knew that they knew each other. So we get together for our session. They're smugglers. They're all smugglers on a smuggling ship. I put them in a warehouse, a deal's going down, they're getting their supplies just right at the beginning. Then stormtroopers just attack the warehouse. Well, that threw them right into combat. They got to use their characters. They escaped the combat. And then they had a whole bunch of questions. Did their contact betray them? Why did the stormtroopers attack them? How did they find them? One character is like, can I hack the database of, the terminal of the warehouse? And I'm like, well, Star Wars, that probably everything has a computer terminal on it, right? So sure. And then they escaped. They had all these questions, and they just started looking into them. And I was just able to react to them, which questions they were kind of pursuing, what was in their cargo. They wanted to check out the cargo, and I just started reacting to them, and it kind of just snowballed right off into a campaign. And I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts about that.
that's a great way to go, because really, when you're starting in the middle of the conflict, we've been talking about questions that you want to generate in the mind of whoever's participating or viewing or reading the thing. What the heck is going on is the question, right? And so and the great thing about what the heck is going on in your particular situation creates a bunch of spin-off questions. What's in the cargo? Why were we attacked? Who betrayed us? And so it's a very strong way to get the story going. And whether you're doing very little prep or you're doing a lot of prep, I think one aspect to keep in mind is the purpose. And again, the purpose is to tell a compelling story, not to just have a ton of action and make it feel exciting, but it has to lead somewhere. The answers to those questions, even if you don't know them in advance, or if you have planned for them in advance, they have to lead to a place that's going to be satisfying, or else starting off in the middle of something is going to feel like a gimmick. They have to serve the characters that are there. They have to serve the overall story that's being told, the thematic questions that are going to be coming up continuously throughout the campaign. That's a really important thing to keep in mind. You can't do it just to do it. You have to do it with purpose.
Yeah, and I think that is such a great point, that we forget. And I think even going back to some movies, kind of to use them as some examples, I think a very clear example of that is to say Raiders of the Lost Ark. We get this whole opening sequence of Indiana Jones kind of going into the temple, and then switching out the idol for the sandbag, and then of course, running out. And what I think, there are a lot of imitators to that, and you can see some action movies that will have us start in kind of an action scene at the beginning. The problem is in Raiders of the Lost Ark, we are shown that, that whole opening sequence shows us that Indiana Jones is very good at what he does. He takes a lot of unnecessary risks. And at the end, when he comes out of the temple, we're introduced to the villain. We are introduced to Belloc. That is going to be the villain and cause all kinds of complications later on. And I think sadly, some movies, see kind of that thing and they say, oh, well, we'll have this action scene at the beginning and then we'll have, kind of the main movie start. And they don't realize that that initial intro set up the character of Indiana Jones, gave us our villain, and set the whole stage, instead of not just a, kind of a disconnected scene showing our hero do some kind of extreme sports or something, and then never relate to anything in the later part of the movie.
Exactly. It's viewed more as a set piece than a way to tell a dramatic and compelling story, or present a dramatic and compelling situation. You're absolutely right about that. And the thing that you have to remember when you're thinking about, oh, wouldn't it be so awesome if this happened or this exploded and then everybody's running around, you have to separate yourself from that, from what the players, if it's a RPG setting, what the players are going to be feeling in the moment and what they're going to be feeling, 3 sessions from now. Are they going to look back and go, that was kind of pointless, actually. I mean, it was fun in the moment, but it hasn't really had any ripple effect, and that's okay if it's like that, the, Star Trek plot bomb, right? Like you want them to kind of forget that these things are, you kind of reassure them, don't worry, it'll wrap back around. But if you're hearing that and you're thinking, oh yeah, I guess none of that has really come back, you got to either figure out a way to make it come back, or just, reflect on that moment and realize that, okay, yeah, that it does have to have more purpose or more intentionality with the overall thing here. It can't just be exciting for the moment if you're interested in telling, a long form story that's really going to feel satisfying from start to finish.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the stormtroopers attacking the warehouse should lead to some bigger thing, something that is connected with what our characters are interested in and are doing, instead of just being just a minor little kind of inconvenience for a little bit, and some fun shoot 'em up action for a partial session or something like that. And I think
and
that,
don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be any fun and games, in the
sure.
Odyssey of the Dragon Lords campaign that I'm playing right now. I have a Minotaur with a lot of big weapons, and I do a lot of beheading and gutting, and I love that my character gets to do those things. I mean, that was the allure of that particular character to me, to be very physical and aggressive in the attacks. So I don't read into that to say everything has to be at this higher level of art. I mean, you got to have the fun moments in there, but there's a way to balance it.
Sure. And and especially in a role-playing game, there's always the time for a random encounter, or the guards at the entrance, that you can just cut through and do some really cool stuff with, that don't seemingly kind of connect to some big kind of mosaic later on. But the idea is I think when you're talking about a crucial moment like the crucial moment of starting the campaign, or a crucial moment in a certain character's backstory. If we to continue the example, if I introduce the character's sister as the crime boss, and that's all she is, then it doesn't really make any sense. But she's the crime boss who the players owes money to, or who they've been working against, or or something like that, to add the extra, to add that extra layer in there on a scene like that. If you're in the woods and you attack, and you're attacked by 6 dire wolves or whatever, you can have some of that eye candy and some of that flipping around and using two-handed, great swords and stuff like that. But if you introduce an element that seems like it should be bigger, then, if there's even a hint that it seems like it should be bigger, it should be bigger than that.
Yeah. I completely agree with everything you said there, Matt. It's the layering, it's the connective tissue, all of that just creates whatever you're working on, or makes whatever you're working on a lot stronger.
Yeah. And I do apologize. We've been talking now for a long time. I want to respect your time. And I'm sure we could go on and on with more examples and that. But why don't you just tell us what you've been working on recently, and where can we find some of your awesome comic books and some of your other works?
Yeah, absolutely. So hollowharbor.com is the place to start. That's got information on the comics that we make. We've got a sci-fi book called Earth After Mutation. We have a fantasy adventure comic that I'm working on right now called Tyrants. We're almost finished with the 5th issue of that, and then the 6th and final issue is actually, we're getting ready to get the covers and the sequential art going on that. So we're nearing the end of that particular story. So really, really excited to wrap that up and tell that full, complete story. We talked about hooks and planting seeds and generating momentum. There's something about getting to the final issue of a comic where that is paying off. You want to reward your readers for their investment, for staying with you that long. And, those things that, like you said, maybe didn't feel as important in an earlier issue, they come back in an important way. So I'm really excited to get to the end of that. And so hollowharbor.com is the place to start. We're on social media, Instagram at Hollow Harbor, and then you can find our books a number of online places like Drive-Thru Comics, or Amazon Kindle, or Global Comics, which is a new platform that has our books as well. So any of those places are going to be, you can search them on the internet, or you can find them through the website. But that's what we've been working on lately. We're really looking forward to getting back to some comic conventions here, hopefully in the near future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will be sure to put links to hollowharbor.com and to some of your books in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So if you are listening right now, I would highly encourage you to head over to dicegeeks.com, check out the show notes for this episode so you can see some of what Josh is up to and his amazing comic books. Well, Josh, it was just a pleasure to speak with you again. Great fun. Obviously, some great tips and wisdom again in this episode. So, I'm definitely going to have to invite you back on in the future. But just thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I'd love to be back. It's always a pleasure talking with you. And I'm looking forward to finishing up the Spaceport Gambit. And I will definitely reach out once I finish to tell you how excited I was to get through it.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Josh today. He had some really incredible insights into story hooks and story openings. I really hope that you got a lot out of it today, whether you are running games, whether you are thinking about stories, or you're writing. I think it was incredibly, incredibly helpful, and I really appreciate him coming back on the show. Now, as I mentioned in the episode, you can go to dicegeeks.com and check out the show notes for this episode, where I have placed links to his comic book company and some of his comic books. Please check those out. They are well worth your time. All right, guys, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show. And each and every Friday, you'll get an email update from me letting you know what is going on in the world of Dice Geeks. All right, guys, I've been given the pitch at the top of the show, so I won't bore you too much with it again here, but just the show could really use your help. I could really use your help. Like, rate, review, subscribe. Much appreciated. All right, guys, each and every Wednesday, I bring you a fantastic interview. So, until next time, keep gaming!